The closest that I have ever felt to any kind of singular spirit sweeping through a body of people or a city is in the fall of 2004 when I was living in Boston. Breaking the 86-year curse of the Bambino, the Red Sox came back from a 0-3 losing streak against the Yankees in the American League Championships to win that series in Game 7, and then went on to sweep the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Championship in just 4 games. Boston was electric. My professors had already canceled exams and classes that week. No one was studying. Everybody was watching. It was, I suppose, for a bunch of divinity school students, a lesson in the sociology of religion. The religion of baseball, that is. You have to understand that that night that they won, people were hanging out of their windows screaming, blasting air horns. The streets were flooded. Fire trucks parked in intersections and allowed people to climb up on their ladders and celebrate. Children had no bedtime, it appeared, as infants and toddlers and elementary school kids were all over the streets with their parents. And the next morning, when I was on the subway on my way to work, instead of that awkward silence when you're crammed, shoulder to shoulder, reading your paper or ignoring the person next to you, everyone was abuzz, talking to each other. People were handing out free papers and coffee. Random strangers were high-fiving. And grown men were embracing in tears, saying they had been waiting their whole life for that moment. When I finally did get to work that morning and walked into the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where I was a chaplain, even the hospital had a different air about it. It was an air of hope. After all the unthinkable had happened, the Red Sox had defied all odds and won. You can only imagine how that kind of win inspired people who were living with terminal diagnoses. If the Red Sox could break the 86-year curse, maybe their bodies could defeat the disease that was cursing them. This spirit, whatever it was palpable and powerful. The whole celebration lasted a few weeks, or really a year, if you're a Bostonite, but it was really unlike anything I had ever experienced for those first 12 to 24 hours. Your ears were ringing from being outside. People were being kind to each other and smiling, and when I asked myself, what is going on here? Why is this? This is just a baseball game, right? But I think it was because this one thing, this baseball game, this moment brought everyone together across differences and divides. People were united as Red Sox fans on that day. And even people who were not fans of the Red Sox, they were happy for them. Because really, 86 years is a long time to lose. We have our nonagenarians in the congregation with us today. They can tell you 86 years, well, it's almost a lifetime, right? So this was my spirit-sweeping experience, and every year since then, when I read the story of Pentecost, this is my reference point. I was in the right place at the right time at this moment in history, and it was incredible. And I imagine you might have your own spirit-sweeping experience as well. Sometime when words just don't capture the feeling in the room or the stadium or the concert hall or the downtown march, wherever you are. Well, Pentecost was set up already to be this kind of day of celebration. It was already going to be a wonderful day because it was a Jewish festival. They were gathered in Jerusalem for what is called the Festival of Weeks, or Shavuot. This was a festival to celebrate the harvest. Shavuot means weeks, literally, and of course Pentecost now means 50. Now these feasts in the Jewish faith were kind of connected to the agricultural cycle for the purposes of making sacrifices at the temple. because it's when everybody could get away from their homes and from their land to gather together in Jerusalem. However, these festivals are more deeply connected to significant moments in the story of the Jewish people. For example, at Passover, which would have been 50 days beforehand, that story is tied very deeply to the deliverance of the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And Pentecost, this festival of the harvest, commemorates the giving of the Ten Commandments, the law that came down on Mount Sinai. And so everyone is already in town for this festival, and Jews have gathered from all over the Mediterranean region in Jerusalem to make these grain offerings. But because they're all from different places, and they speak different languages, they don't really understand one another. They can't understand each other. And so as they're going to the temple to make their offerings, they know that they're unified in this action, but they're probably really not able to communicate. And even more, what may be lost on us today that we need to remember is that this is not just a random group of people from all different countries. You see, the Parthians were an empire that threatened Rome from the east. The Medes and the Elamites are two of the greatest enemies of Israel. Cappadocia and Pamphylia are districts of great Jewish populations with many people who rejected Jesus. And Egypt and Cyrene are places where many missionaries came from to share the message of Jesus. So you see, the people gathered in Jerusalem that day were all over the place in terms of their relationship to Jesus and this new movement that had started in Jerusalem and around Galilee. And all of a sudden, the Spirit shows up. And it shows up with a mighty rushing wind and flames of fire. Those are two of the scariest natural forces, mind you, wind and fire. And when you put them together, they are a deadly combination. But here in this moment, they combine to give life. And it reminds us of a story just 50 days earlier when crucifixion led to an empty tomb. Here, what could have been a deadly combination of flame and wind leads to an inspiration that changes the life of the church forever. It is a true celebration. What's remarkable about this, I think, is that the people talking in different languages in this text are just the 12 disciples. Right before this passage, Matthias had just been named as the new 12th disciple, replacing Judas. And they must have been so loud in their speaking, loud as in like breaking the curse of the bambino loud, that crowds started to gather around them. And as the crowds gathered around them, seeing the tongues of fire and hearing this wind and hearing them speak, something remarkable happened. These people who did not speak their language or know their language began to speak in the native tongues of all these countries that were represented. They were hearing their own language spoken in a country where they didn't expect that, right? So no wonder that they were confused and bewildered and excited and a little skeptical. You heard the comment from the choir about the wine, right? Some people thought they were drunk. You have to imagine, though, that even for the ones who were skeptical and confused, I would have to think that just hearing their own language spoke so many miles from home must have made them feel welcome. Because no matter who they were or where they came from or what animosities and fears they held against one another, in that moment, they were seen. And they were united not by a common language, but by diverse and specific languages that spoke to each of them uniquely and personally of this common love of God in Christ. Now, if you've ever been to a country where you don't speak the language, I just got back from one, the Republic of Georgia. It really is a remarkable gift of hospitality when someone actually utters a few phrases in your native tongue. When we would hear the people of Georgia speak English, it was like this great gift of blessing because for that moment we were able to communicate. And it's very humbling because in reality, you know you are the one that's in the Republic of Georgia. You should be learning Georgian. They should not have to know English to welcome you. And yet, even a phrase or two allows you into that place of welcome and hospitality. It's a reminder of something familiar, right? It's comforting to be able to communicate in your own native tongue. And perhaps in that moment of comfort, you're allowed to hear even a more challenging word because there is familiarity. It creates kind of a container to hear something that might be a little bit more difficult or challenging to hear. You see, Pentecost is about the fact that beyond all of our earthly languages is the language of God's love. Right? That is the language that allows us to be united, to cultivate an understanding even in the midst of our diversity. It's not a moment of unity of thought or belief or expression. It's a moment of unity in God's Spirit. And at Pentecost, we see that manifest in really important ways. I'm calling this the phonetics of fire. And this is why I'm thinking about Pentecost in this way. Because when we talk about just words, about language, we often think about putting together correct or grammatically correct sentences. Already that's not a grammatically correct sentence, but we think about spelling things right and following the grammar rules and maybe even having the right beliefs or theology. However, the language of Pentecost, this language of the Spirit, the phonetics of fire, is about something much deeper than grammar or spelling or punctuation. It is about the sound of the language being spoken, the shape of the gospel and how it lands on people, how they are able to hear it. It's about the meaning that is conveyed beyond the words that are being spoken. And phonetics is all about this, right? It's about articulation and the acoustics of sound and how speech is perceived. And so in this phonetics of fire, we are reminded that there are things that happen in the spoken word in Pentecost that go far deeper than the surface meaning of the word. There is a loving connection that is made. There is some kind of inspiration that is shared. There's an attentiveness to how the people who are hearing you will receive what is being said. It's, I think, a gift that we all wish we had today, right? That when we spoke words, that they would land how we wanted them to land. Morgan spoke about this last week in her sermon, about how we can sow the seeds, but we're all in different places when we hear those messages. And Pentecost just reaffirms this, that there's this beautiful moment when the words that are spoken are able to land with people because they know the language. I have to say that for us, a lot of times, I think that talking past one another or not in line with one another is really not about our language, but it's about all these other things that can divide us. You know what those things are in our society. You know what it feels like to be around a table or in a room when you share a very different opinion or perspective than those around you. Imagine the next time you're in one of those gatherings around a dinner table here at church, talking to some friends, when a different opinion is shared or a different theological belief. Imagine if as you sat there listening, all of a sudden out of your mouth came the words, the very viewpoints of the people around you that you don't agree with yourself. Can you imagine hearing yourself speak the language of someone who has a different opinion than you? Just try that little exercise at home, right? It's not easy to say statements that you don't believe out loud. And yet, metaphorically speaking, right, this is what is happening at Pentecost. People are speaking a language that's not their own so that others are able to hear. It's a moment that doesn't last forever, right? And it's a moment that may not land on everyone. Pentecost is not about being successful in terms of every word we speak being able to be heard by everyone. But it is a liberating text because it reminds us that when we don't have the right words to speak, perhaps, or when we're struggling to find the language to connect, that God's Spirit will show up if we're open to it, right? If we're able to be open to that flexibility, to know that there is deeper feeling and connection below the surface of the words. I just want to give one example where I've seen this in practice so beautifully. Those of us who were just returning from the Republic of Georgia worshiped one Sunday at a place called the Peace Cathedral in Tbilisi, which is the capital of the Republic of Georgia. This is kind of the main church for the Evangelical Baptist Church in the Republic of Georgia. And you may be thinking, there are Baptists in the Republic of Georgia. Yes, there are Baptists in the Republic of Georgia. There were many Pentecost moments of that day, including the fact that when we showed up to worship, the bishop there turned to me and said, "Do you want to preach today?" Which was an act of hospitality, so of course I said yes, and in about 45 minutes came up with a sermon, and of course it was translated, and so who knows how the Spirit moved and what was actually said that morning. But I trust that the Spirit did move, and here's why. Because the Peace Cathedral is this amazing place in Georgia where the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, is kind of the state religion there. So 85% of the people in Georgia are Orthodox. Well, the evangelical Baptists there know that they have to speak a common language with the Orthodox in order to get their message across. And so they're very high church in how they're structured. They have bishops and districts, very un-Baptist-like, right? They wear really fancy robes, fancier than these robes, and big necklaces and jewels. There's incense in the service. There's processionals in and out. The service was, I think, about 2.5 hours, 2 hours. It was long. Very pomp and circumstance, if you will, like the Orthodox Church. They keep a lot of the Orthodox liturgy. And all of this is to create a familiar container, because they knew that in order to get at some of the Baptist things that they wanted to communicate in Georgia, things like embracing the laity and diverse opinions and beliefs and working for freedom of religious expression. In order to do that, they couldn't change everything. They had to keep a common container, speak a language of Orthodox worship and structure that people would understand. They're doing this both and of holding the language of their origin while learning to speak a new language as well. And they're changing lives and doing amazing things because of it. In a future presentation, I hope to share with you the ministry of this church, because it really is remarkable. And I hold it in my mind as an example of what Pentecost can look like today, of how you and I can learn to speak in a way that allows others to follow Jesus as the way. It's not easy. There'll be a lot of confusion and miscommunication along the way. But it is a beautiful thing when that happens. And the Spirit of God is calling us as a church to that prophetic witness. May we be the ones who listen and speak with the phonetics of fire. Amen.